to identify a problem in society and come up with a solution as an entrepreneur is not the same as to run a large company that possibly has hundreds and thousands of more people working for it now when it becomes a public company than it was when it started first from your garage. A few things I'll do in this speech. First, give a few points of setup as to what this looks like. Secondly, talk about why founders are unlikely to be able to successfully manage a public company compared to individuals who have experience in managerial roles. And finally, talk about why consumers are going to be better benefited on our side of the house. Firstly, then, on setup. I think these individuals who are founders can stay on in other roles in the company, i.e. as advisors or board members. They're just not going to be the CEO or CFO or those types of roles that are responsible for management and that are higher up in the chain and manage a lot of other employees who are below them. But secondly, I think we're going to open up these C-suite roles to other individuals, such as people who have experience in management in other companies who can apply through the traditional job application routes or who have worked in other managerial positions within this company itself. Why do we think, firstly, then, that these founders are going to be comparatively less skilled in terms of managing a public company compared to individuals who would otherwise come into these positions? I think, firstly, the goal of a public company is very different from a private company. That is to say, public companies want to expand their operations. They want to increase the scale of this company after a problem has already been identified and a solution has been identified. Previously, you could only tap into a few private investors or angel investors or VC companies. Now you have access to a greater amount of equity. The ways you receive funding and the ways you get people to buy into your company is very different. And the founders are likely not well adjusted to this kind of operation of a company. But secondly, we think that founders are not likely to have the skill sets necessary for running a public company. Why do we think this is the case? Founders focus on creation and innovation rather than the maintenance of a company. That is to say, they identify a problem in society, sometimes through their own personal experience. In a lot of cases, founders are able to come up with a solution. If they are trained in STEM, maybe they come up with a solution for an issue that occurs in STEM. This is what they're trained towards, is coming up with a solution in society. But secondly, I think that design an innovative solution that they think people will buy into. They're often attached emotionally to this sort of vision because they think that they're solving a huge problem. They are specifically tied to the solution that they come up with, rather than an idea of a market structure or company that is actually sustainable and profitable in the long term. But thirdly, they often outsource even the creation of the solution itself. So even if they have an idea of what the solution could look like, they might not themselves be skilled in the actual creation of it. They might not know what is actually involved in this. Why do we think the CEOs that come into power after IPOs, who, when the founder leaves, would necessarily have the skills necessary to do this well? Firstly, I think they would have a greater idea of how to increase scale, given that they are likely to know this in a better way. This is because entrepreneurs are only used to dealing with a small team. That is to say, they start with 5 or 10 employees. They are used to working with this group of people. They oftentimes start their startup right after college or early on in their careers, which means that they don't have experience working for a large company or knowing what it takes to deal with a larger term. In contrast, we think people who have worked in previous managerial roles have experience running large teams, having several layers of bosses and employees below them, and they're able to better deal with the scale of the company. But secondly, we also think they're better able to deal with the increasing scale of the company itself. That is to say, they're able to do things like cut costs and run operations. I think this is particularly important because we think the founders are unlikely to do these sorts of things, given that they have an emotional attachment to the company itself. The emotional attachment means that, one, they don't want to move away from their vision. They care about the types of things that they've decided to spend money on, and they think that this is particularly necessary for the perfection of their solution. They want to make sure that the product that they're putting out is perfect to their vision, even if this is not necessarily what is necessary in the market. But secondly, they're likely to be willing to take risks that are otherwise not sustainable in the market. That is to say, they believe that their idea is exceptional because they have a personal bias. So they think that in the long term, these risks will pay off, even if someone who works in a managerial role thinks, no, not necessarily, this doesn't align with the market incentives and the market structures. So we think that they're going to be tied to a certain conception over profit, which is going to cause the company to tank if the attachment to the vision doesn't align with the needs and the vision of the public. But fourthly here, we also think that the people who have managerial roles, who have worked in managerial roles at other companies, are likely to have a larger understanding of the industry. That's to say, they've worked at companies that might also be in tech, but that do other things in tech. And so they have experience in other companies and are thus less likely to be, one, susceptible to sort of exceptionalism we talk about that founders are susceptible to, but also secondly, they're less likely to think, they're more likely to understand how this company fits in with the other companies within the industry and therefore be able to fit their niche better. Before I move on, closing.
If all of this was true, wouldn't we see a lot of companies going belly up after they go through IPO? Why is that not happening? If it's not, then why is your analysis true?
I think this has happened. I think obviously we think about like certain instances where there are founders who are thought of as exceptional, like cult of personality leaders, which is why in terms of the media, we don't think about the cases where this doesn't happen because the media doesn't cover every startup that has failed. But also secondly, I do think that in lots of cases, like Twitter and other companies that have gone public, that have changed from their founders to other CEOs, we have seen stocks go up significantly. So I don't think this is true factually either. So the implications of this connected to that POI is that I think the stocks in the company are likely to gain higher value on our side of the house, insofar as we think that investors within the industry are more likely to have trust in people who have worked those managerial roles rather than founders who they don't know what kinds of skills they have or what kind of knowledge they have in running a larger company. But secondly, we also think that the stocks are likely to be higher value given that the media coverage is likely to be more positive given recent memories of companies that have done better after they've switched from the founder to other individuals taking on these CEO type roles. We think that this means that customers are also able to, or like people who buy stocks are also likely to have more trust in this opening.
Is this a problem for stability for investors to know that your management is in question as you're trying to raise money for an IPO?
Right, what I'm saying, I don't exactly know what you mean, because what I'm saying is that when you have management, when you switch management, this is good because investors are likely to think that the founders themselves don't have the skills to go through with the IPO. I don't think it's a problem that the management is questioned. It shows that you're adjusting to the market and you're adjusting to the fact that you're becoming a public company. Why do we think this is necessarily going to be better for consumers? I think firstly, they're more likely to have trust in non-founder CEOs, given that there's a perception that founders don't have the skills that are necessary. This is something that has been covered extensively in the media, which means that you're likely to think of these founders as eccentrics who are not in touch with reality, who come up with a solution but can't actually bring the solution to reality. We think that on the consumer side, there's going to be more trust. On our side of the house. But secondly, we think this also democratizes say in the company and makes products and solutions more in line with the vision of the public. Why is this the case? I think founders often have a cult of personality behind them. They control discussions and voting when they are in power because they say, this is my product, this is how it ought to look. They're able to strong-arm other individuals into supporting their vision. But people on the ground are likely to have a better sense. And we think that given that people who are in managerial roles don't have that sense of an emotional attachment, they care more about ensuring there's profit that comes out of the public, they're less likely to do this, and they're more likely to democratize say in how the solution is sort of envisioned because they want to make sure that this reaches the public, that this is something that the public wants so that they're actually able to make money. Finally, we think that these founders are able to move on and innovate new things when they're no longer caught up in the C-suite of the original company. For all these reasons, I'm proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that. Stage now to open the debate inside opposition. I'll call upon leader of UP. Here.
When Steve Jobs was replaced by a Pepsi CEO with more experience and evidence of expanding, Apple nearly went under and begged Steve Jobs to come back. Consistency and an understanding of product vision matters. This is what we provide on OO. Ref first, then two arguments. One on why going public is incredibly delicate and the norm of continuity is essential toward business stability. And second, on why this is critical toward making these companies go public in the first place and why that's so important. First of all, in terms of the arguments we get from proposition, they say that you have no experience when it comes to things like expansion. But fact check this in your head. This is literally what you've been doing. You've taken a small business that you have started with 2 or 3 people and made it sufficiently big that it is going out and it is comfortable going to millions of people and saying, we want your money and you should trust us with it. That means that you have scaled and you have reached a size where people are willing to actually put their money into you. So that means that you are comfortable and people are comfortable with your demonstrated expertise. They say that CEOs are better because entrepreneurs are used to small teams. This actually usually isn't true. Usually you work in banks or in any number of businesses, and the reason you've worked through management and developed that experience is because you don't just know problems that exist in the world by virtue of living in a college dorm. You learn them by going out into the world, getting job experience, and seeing the things that make your job harder, and being like, hey, I need a solution to this. So that's why, by and large, these people are actually highly experienced. But finally, they say that you don't want to move away from the vision. I think that this is a product that people already buy into, so that vision is important. But more than that, investors are willing to buy into that vision. Amazon, for example, was unprofitable for years and years and years, literally decades of its time, because investors bought into the vision that Amazon was going to become profitable and would be a worthwhile investment. So that suggests that this is actually something that people are willing to buy into, and that continuation of a vision that people like matters and is enough to get investors on side. First argument on why going public is incredibly delicate. It is worth noting that IPOs in and of themselves can be dangerous. Shocks to your value on the first day can lead to net losses, sorry, I replaced the N and the L in my notes, that are difficult to get over. Preserving your leadership, on the other hand, ensures long-term confidence. Why does preserving your C-suite actually maintain this confidence? One, there is huge amount of trust in your leadership. First of all, at the level that you've actually proven yourself capable of building a company, even at their worst case, and you're unexperienced, you've proven that you can build a massive multi-million-dollar or multi-billion-dollar company with minimal experience. That should be even more indicative to investors of your talent and your capacities to actually lead. But second, the level that you actually understand the vision. This is why Steve Jobs was considered so important to Apple and why he was returned after that replacement, and why Wall Street rallied around Apple once they brought him back. Second, because employees believe in these C-suite executives, so you can expect that there will be a minimal shift in the makeup of talent. Notice that in the process of doing something like starting a startup, that it requires a lot of teamwork, it requires a lot of late nights. That means that you get close with your colleagues and you form relationships with them, and that means that you want to see them leading you. You want them to be in the C-suite, and you want to work for these people because they're the ones that have brought you on this long mission that was required to make this company valuable. So that means that investors can expect that lots of people won't be fleeing because the bosses that they like, or the bosses whose vision they feel connected to, isn't leading at the very next day. Third, because they don't need time to adapt, and this is really important. In the side of government, you bring in someone new, and they need to learn the ropes of the company. They need to make sure that the valuation, they need to understand what makes the company work. They need to provide this valuation. They need to see what products are good and what products are bad, what is working here, what is wrong with the system. And that means that in the first months, for example, since you IPO, you as an investor have very minimal confidence that this company is going to be run well, or that the person that was brought in actually has knowledge or understanding of how to do that. As a comparative, dropping this leadership leads to huge volatility and often collapse. This is important because, why does volatility and a huge collapse actually matter? Why does volatility matter? First, it scares investors. Fresh companies in and of themselves are quite risky, so you feel uncomfortable funding it going forward. But it's also about retail investors, people like you and me that might give our money to a company that we're excited about, but might feel uncomfortable doing so if we see that the people that started that company are running away, or there's an initial dip in valuation that makes us feel a little bit uncertain about whether or not we actually want to put our money there going forward. But second, because it makes it hard to make investment decisions as a business yourself. Usually you enter into an IPO in anticipation of huge cash needs, which is why you're raising money in the first place. If it takes months to restore investor confidence, then you're not able to make those decisions rapidly, and you're not able to expand as quickly as is necessary. Closing gut.
Yeah, so this law changes as a whole, so if everyone leaves afterwards, presumably these shocks to the market will be relatively stable, or at least we would expect that a change is going to happen, which is why volatility does not occur.
No. It doesn't matter if they expect that it'll happen. The fact that they expect that it'll happen only means they're not surprised when people leave, but not that they, as a result, have trust in the company. They just expect to lose trust, and that is bad. Second argument on why this is critical to making companies go public. Companies often need to go public. They need to make their products known well so that they can expand marketing. They need to get funding so that these projects can actually expand, so that they can grow the company. On their side, you probably end up not going public at a much higher rate. C-suite executives, per some of their analysis, probably want their jobs for a lot of reasons. They're probably very passionate about the work. It's probably quite high paying. They probably feel that they are quite good at it and actually have a huge amount of knowledge about the product that they are supporting. This creates a huge disincentive to going public, and that is really harmful for a few reasons. First, OG.
Your argumentation is entirely contingent on the fact that the C-suite has been effective in the past. But we tell you that your funding sources now change when you turn towards equity rather than a handful of investors. How is the past C-suite able to...
Your past C-suite has been effective. You've started a company from nothing. You've made it worth millions of dollars. You made it to a point of confidence that you're willing to go to the public and say, you should give us your money. The money that you have worked for, you should bet on us, and it'll help feed your family if you do so. That is a lot of confidence. That shows that the C-suite is trusted by Wall Street already, who's probably motivating you and saying, yeah, you probably should go public, guys. Okay. Why then is it harmful if you don't go public? One, either, let's say at their best, you do go public, but you do so slowly. This is problematic because you get access to the funding you need at a slower rate, which means your capacity to expand is shortened, and the ability to make financial decisions that you need to do, like setting up new factories, for example, is slowed, and that slows progress. Second, maybe you don't go public, and this is bad because you will probably go under in these cases. Often in these moments of unparalleled stress, I think that executives might make the wrong decision of believing that they can tough it out just because of their belief that they've been able to do it before. This means that you might make the mistake of not going public, and that company will suffer. Why is going public something we think in and of itself is positive and you should care about as a judge? One, it forces these businesses to provide quarterly information to investors so that they can actually have transparent information about how that company is operating. Two, it opens them up to substantial funding. This allows them to do things like improve their product, but also to lower and reduce its cost so that it becomes more accessible to more people, and that is valuable. Third, it allows the average retail investor, people like you and me, to be able to profit from solid businesses. It allows us to actually put money into things and get money out of it so that we have an easier time saving for college, things like that. This is all financially valuable, so we should care that these companies are available to us and not just billionaires. On this basis, we oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to further the case of open government, I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister here.
The doomsday comparative that Isaac talks about in the end of his speech won't happen. Because if these are CEOs that are so territorial about their company and company decisions, they'll decide to not launch the IPO on either side. Like, the territorial nature of this will be ruined in either case, even if you still remain the CEO. Because you're still forced to do public disclosure. You're forced to report more things. You're forced to expand the board and make certain decisions in a more democratic way, as long as you're doing an IPO, even if you're still in a C-suite decision. So these are CEOs who have an expressed preference that they're willing to give up some of the territorial nature or the decision-making power in exchange for expansion, which Isaac agrees to be the goals of the public company. So that is the goal and the fundamental future that this company wants and envision, and is the most important outcome in this round. Another clarification at the top is this is after IPOs. So the raising of resources for the IPO or the preparation for it will be done well on either side. Like, this perception continuity will still happen when it comes to that valuation in the first place. Three things then from OG. One, the success of the company. Two, consumers and workers having more say. And lastly, the market and industry as a whole. First thing, on the success of the company. Let's rebut the bulk of their case about the norm of continuity. One, they don't tell you why you have to be in the C-suite for this norm to continue. If I'm an advisor, I'm the creative director or the tech director of Apple, I will still be able to give that creative input and my innovation that makes Apple Apple as Steve Jobs. What is uniquely bad about C-suite? What is uniquely bad about being in the C-suite is that you have control over all other structures of the whole system. So the systems you publicly disclose, the HR, accountability mechanisms, investors have less trust in all those structures you set up because they think you already have a cult of personality, you're also the founder, now you also have executive decision-making power, nothing's going to change, these structures are not going to work. So we can preserve that perception continuity by having your creative input and give investors that trust on our side, but it's just bad to undermine all the systems you disclose that give investors this accountability that says there's a safety net, this company's not going to go haywire in this case. But two, the volatility they want to talk about is inevitable because at some point Jeff Bezos is going to retire. At some point they're going to disappear. So eventually the founder will make an exit. Why is it better that the exit happens at the IPO? There are two reasons. One, because if the founder continues the cult of personality and becomes more and more tied to the central image of Amazon, then scandals or them leaving, them dying or retiring takes a way harder hit. Because if you have a longer time investment of this company, there's just more of the perception that a company is only successful because of you. That's why when Bezos had the divorce scandal, stock prices took a massive hit. But two, because in the stage of the IPO, investors expect a degree of volatility because it's a period of change. So it doesn't massively undermine confidence that there's some volatility because that's the expectation. Versus if Amazon's doing great, one day Jeff Bezos suddenly leaves, they're not going to expect any volatility. That takes a harder shock on investor confidence. So if anything, continuity and volatility is way worse on their side. But what does UMA tell you? UMA tells tells you that it is not about the perception of continuity. We're talking about the actual skill set mismatches that makes us unable to fulfill the goals of a public company. Like 1, the survivor bias that makes you more risk-loving. 2, they have an emotional attachment, which means you don't listen to people. You want to look at the grand vision rather than delivering on the promises you make to shareholders of like delivering profits on an annual basis. And 3, that they're more techie, not as managerial, and can't like control a larger company and stuff like that, an expanded company. Why do you prefer this analysis over what Isaac is telling you? 1, because from the perspective of investors, they're not making decisions based on the perception of continuity. They're basing it on years of research that these skills are just mismatched. So investors are unlikely to just do it based on like a perception of what's going on, like the vibe check of the company, rather than when they notice that there's a skill set mismatch, they will not like trust this company as much. But 2, I want to talk about the everyday investors they want to talk about who are buying stocks, because these are people who are taking their income and they're facing the expectation of like, I want to make some money, I want steady growth, I want like reports back of like some like profits every single year, because like we don't make a lot of money as middle class people. That's what they're expecting. The issue is founders, when they have a grand vision for the future, they're just more risk loving. They want to make Twitter like the end all be all platform more than they care about delivering on annual results, especially because they used to work with angel investors who are willing to cross subsidize when they're operating at losses, and that hurts the everyday people who they want to talk about who are buying stocks on their side of house. And lastly, again, like CEO wants to kind of like strawman and say these companies will just like belly flop completely. That's not what our argument is about. It's about if your company is marginally more successful, these everyday stock buyers get more return, consumers get slightly better product. Like this is not about like a doomsday debate. It's about that slight comparative in terms of the probability of success and whose skills are better in growing the future of the company, because workers, consumers, and stock buyers all rely on it. Before I move on to the second argument, closing.
If you're right about founders, and they have a really strong vision and cult of personality, why are they going to stay on board to advise people who are doing the exact opposite of all the things they wanted to do in their company?
No, because I think like tech and managerial is like relatively separate. So for example, I'm a coding person. I really care that the interface is super smooth. I still feel like I have that creative control when I talk to the coders of Apple. But the managerial stuff is way more abstract. It's about like how many people do you station in Florida? How many like do you set up the banking structure in Finland? I don't really particularly care what the board is doing there. So they will still be happy in those roles in that attachment. Like you don't prove to me why like as a techie person like Steve Jobs who codes out of his like garage before, that's what they're going to care about. Second point, why consumers and workers have more say. Note how Isaac gives no response to what Uma talks about how like we get more democratization of the process of making decisions. IPO gives us the mechanism for accountability, because consumers and workers can use brand loyalty to buy your stock and want to buy more stock and your company's valuation goes up. Or if there's a scandal and you mistreat people, they can dump your stock and your company's valuation goes down. We get that mechanism through IPOs. How do they ruin it? They ruin it exactly through the cult of personality that they perpetuate. That there's a massive power dynamic that goes on in the company. That you can't criticize Jeff Bezos because he's still at a position of power as a worker. And when it's repeatedly emphasized that Jack Ma is the reason why we have Alibaba and stuff like that, you feel less of the ability to challenge what they're doing and like backlash by like talking about all these things and using the accountability mechanism of dumping the stocks and like affecting the valuation. In this case, all the mechanisms of democratization of decision-making processes only stand on our side of house. But lastly, I want to talk about the market and the industry as a whole. Let's say for some reason we do not win the debate about like how the company is going, even though we're the only ones who tells you about the skills and the goals of a public company and how they mismatch. Even then, we think society is going to be better off if there's a norm that perpetuates these very creative people to leave their original company. Because on their side, you can stay on as the CEO of Twitter, make massive amounts of money, and just live a very comfortable lifestyle when that is your day-to-day job. But if you're going to leave, there's going to be a hole in your heart. Like, I'm no longer attached to this tech company. I previously had a lot of pride with my job and stuff like that. You're left with this person who's extremely talented, has connections to angels investors, and like has the money to start a new firm, and this hole inside their heart longing for something more, a new initiative. Then you push them to create new companies, more innovation, and more products that are life-changing. The clearest example of this is when Jack Dorsey left Twitter, he started working on Block, this new payment app, this new platform, because you have this person who, with the norm of departing from the company, have the ability and the incentive to create something new. Then even if we marginally lose on how good the company is going to be down the line, society better utilize resources when we create more platforms and more products and new groundbreaking things that improve people's lives. Because we actually give you the mismatch of skills. We tell you how people make decisions. We're so proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close the debate in the opening half, I call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
on to the two main questions of this debate, i.e., are C-suite leaders essential to IPOs launching successfully? And two, how many IPOs happen in the first place? I first want to chat about when IPOs happen and why it's so important that we have them happen frequently. IPOs happen usually when companies need more capital. And we know that oftentimes the need for capital is quite strong because when you go public, you inevitably lose a degree of autonomy. You become accountable to different shareholders, there's a degree of uncertainty about what you can and cannot do. And usually founders are reluctant to impose that upon themselves. So the reason this matters then is you have a large set of companies who would otherwise be growing a lot slower or even going the risk of running red if they don't go public. That's why it's so important for us to have these happen and have them happen successfully. Two main questions then. First, on C-suite leaders and why they're so important to IPOs launching successfully. The first thing Isaac gave you here is the idea of uncertainty, i.e. when there's a completely unknown factor when you're investing into a new IPO that you're much less likely to put money into it. We get a smart POI from closing, which is that, well, if this happens to every single company in the market, then doesn't the effect just cancel out? No, it doesn't, because this assumes that interest in IPOs is zero-sum and will just be redistributed between companies no matter what. The issue, though, is you as an investor could instead just put into an existing company or do it or buy government bond, for example, or just put it into the bank. All of these are legitimate investment strategies, but they're worse because one, they are much worse for diversifying market share and increasing competition in the market, but two, also because they're often less productive and less high growth potential and therefore lead to less growth in the long term. IPOs are far better investment. But the second claim we get from OG is the idea that scandal will strike at some point in the future and that it's even worse when power is concentrated in a certain number of established C-suite employees. Two main responses to this, though. The first is that I do think that knowing that the C-suite investor is going through a divorce is a much less bad shock than not knowing who the C-suite investor is in the first place. Because on the former, you're like, there is some tea here, Bezos probably not going to be in top form right now, maybe the company share will tank a bit, but we know it'll be okay because of short-term shock. But on the other hand, when you don't know what the profit is going to be, when you don't know who the person is, how they're going to interact with this particular product, then you do not know what the value of the stock is in the first place, and you do not buy it. But the second main thing is, it's also just happened at a completely different time, right? We're very happy for this uncertainty to kick in, like 2 years after the IPO has happened. No, thank you. But when the IPO initially happens, that this is a much more crucial window of time because the value that the stock, as soon as it hits the market, determines people's perceptions in the long run, but also determines how much it can scale up as the company is just starting. I'll take you guys up forward, thank you. So what's the impact of this then? Every single company, when they go public, gains less money. That's bad because the companies that are counting on large numbers of money from the IPO in order to pay back debt, which is quite likely because even companies with high levels of growth can accumulate massive amounts of debt in the process are much more likely to go into the red and end up having to default, shut down, or otherwise cut employees. But the second thing is growth, even in the best case, ends up slow on their side. You lose momentum, you have less creation of productive industries. We think that that's much worse. The second claim we give, the second clash here then, is about whether or not the core skill set is better on theirs than on ours. Before that, I'll take two POIs. You go.
So if there's a great founder, why can't we just keep them on our side in that one instance, rather than having a norm that is ubiquitous on your side?
Well, one, this mitigates both sides evenly. Two, I also think that it's the case that the amount of stuff you're going to do as an advisor is much less than the person calling the shots in the first place. You.
Companies are not dumb. They're going to hire a new CEO with 5 successful IPOs versus a founder who has no experience with this unique process, which gives more investor confidence.
Well, one, given the norm, we don't think that there are many companies, many investors who have 5 IPOs successfully. Like, you don't make one company go, fuck it, that's one done, let's make another. They take a lot of time, they take a lot of energy, they take a lot of heart. But the second thing is, there are lots of things that no matter how much experience you have, you just don't have control over. So for example, you don't have the connections with the particular angel investors that this company has been dependent on so far. You don't know what this particular product is. There are unexpected things that happen. And I think for those reasons, ours is much better. So then, on the idea of a skill set mismatch, right? Because their claim here is that even if C-suite founders are innovative at the beginning, they don't know how to manage big companies. Well, the first thing to note is I do think that they achieve very little offense here because they don't build a comparative out for why the alternative is better other than abstractly being like companies are smart. But second of all, I just think the characterization of founders as garage gremlins who come up with a wild idea and then retreat back into their garages is really encouraging for a couple of reasons. The first thing is, the fact that these companies have expanded to the point that they are going public suggests that they've already passed all of those loops. They've passed the initial loops of having the first funding, for example, but they've also been able to hire employees well, so they have a large number of demand. But the second thing is, the reason this is true is because these people are a nice thought, I'm going to give up now. These people are special and the ability to take an idea and create a multi-billion-dollar empire. They tell you, but the second set of responses I have is like, look, these people, like, why can't you just acquire the skills necessary to run a company? Like, you can learn these things. You can get an MBA, for example, go to business school. Like, this sounds glib. But what I will say is that these people didn't get uni degrees or a blueprint in how to make Facebook. It requires a really diverse set of skills and the ability to respond to challenges, which implies that they're really, really adaptable people who acquired the skills they needed to guide the company throughout the rest of the process. They're likely to be able to do this into the future as well. To be clear, GovBench also sees investors with a knowledge deficit. They have knowledge deficit in that particular industry because you used to be the CEO of Pepsi and now you're coming into Apple. But two, they also don't understand the particular demographic, the market niche that this company is catering to. And crucially, when a competitor is going to take these people away from you, for example. But three, they also don't understand the idiosyncrasies of your portfolio. So, for example, where you might have assets that are really irrelevant and unstable and need to be reallocated and rearranged. All of these things are much more difficult to learn. One, because there are less resources out there that are going to allow you to train yourself in them. But two, because it's just the case that like even if you're told these things in abstract, you don't have the experience, the instincts that mean that you're able to respond quickly to challenges. For example, you act slowly or act robotically, you act much worse overall. For those reasons, companies are much worse. Finally though, then on companies and whether or not they're going to go public in the first place, Isaac explains to you why this happens. Their response is, if these CEOs are so territorial in the first place, they're not going to bring you public. So there's a huge difference in the degree of autonomy you sacrifice between having restrictions on the extent to which you can lay off people or create new goods, for example, and completely giving the company up to someone else. Like on our side, you still are the face of Apple, for example. You're still the person that people associate with a learning product. It's still your baby, as opposed to being like, oh, we'll now keep you in the closet and ask you for advice sometimes when the company starts doing poorly. Like, this is the product that defines people. There's no way whatsoever that if they're going to have to give something up, that the majority of them are going to be willing to do so. Happy to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to open the debate in the closing half, I call upon the member of government. Here.
The really weird thing about this opening half is they think of this really convoluted method that the CAs have dreamed up of to solve a problem that's actually already been solved. Because under the status quo, if a company has a poor manager, the company has financial and competitive incentives to fire that manager and replace them with a new manager. Or, if it is the case that that manager is still bad, they don't replace that manager, there is a competitive incentive for investors to take away their investment from that company and invest in a different company that has a better manager, and that company rises up. Which means that companies having poor managers, which is the contention of opening half, doesn't actually matter, right? Even if a company has a poor manager, we can just invest in a different company, and that company is likely to be better and deliver more efficient products to society and be more productive for people overall. Where the system breaks down is in two situations. Firstly, where investors are unable to make good choices because they have low information and cannot make good decisions about whether a company is a worthy investment, which, hint, is the case that happens when these founders stay on. Or it is the case that when these people stay on, they're fundamentally so unaccountable in a way that means that their interests do not align with that of shareholders. In those two interests, that's when the system breakdown occurs and the self-correcting mechanism of the market that solves the opening dilemma is unable to solve that dilemma. So, key extension in this debate, how the involvement of a founder is fundamentally accountable. The structure's going to be a bit weird because I'm firstly going to explain the impact of this and why we win the debate on it, and then I'll prove it. So, follow with me. The reason why accountability is crucially important is twofold. The first is the thing I explained in my introduction, which is that the squabble about whether somebody is a good manager or not is not only speculative and example reliant, but ultimately not a question that matters because people can just invest in other companies because companies have competitive incentives to swap those managers out, right? But if we can explain, for example, that those people are fundamentally accountable, then that system where people can determine whether a company is good or not gets broken, right? Like that system of being able to keep that person accountable is broken. But the second reason why extension is the most important is because we provide for the most vulnerable stakeholder, which is the general public, and they hold shares in companies and they expect investments to reflect the worth of what they put in and the risks that they took. At the point at which these people, for their idiosyncratic reasons as founders, are not representing the will of shareholders, that is a breach of a non-contingent principle of their duty to shareholders. Companies in our world should exist to benefit shareholders, and at the point at which some random founder has their own idiosyncratic interest to do whatever their vision is, that is a principal breach of their obligations to shareholders who've put down their money into raising this company. So, why exactly do these incentives misalign? Firstly, founders have fundamentally misaligned incentives with shareholders. Firstly, because they have a set of very idiosyncratic incentives, because their mandate, unlike a chief executive who is newly employed, whose sole mandate is to raise the share price of the company and to please shareholders, they have a set of other incentives, such as, the long-term future of the company, or what their product looks like, or their dream, and all that kind of stuff. And yes, those are mechanisms that OG explained, but they don't actually explain the implications of this mechanism. It's not about whether they're a good manager or not, it's that their incentives are never going to be aligned with that of the shareholders. Secondly, this person has a low reliance on the executive position because they have a lot of capital as a founder, because they own a lot of shares. That is different to a chief executive officer who doesn't have those shares in that company and is newly employed and whose entire job and livelihood is their performance at their job. But thirdly, there's just a lot of obscurity in how that accountability occurs, because OO's mechanism is like, this person has some kind of plan or vision, and we're kind of vibing that that vision or plan probably is good, and if that vision works, then that company might be successful, and therefore it's a good idea to invest in that, which has a lot of logical leaps and speculations along the way. Our form of accountability is just, we have employed a chief executive whose sole mandate and purpose is to raise the share price and bring you more money, which means our incentive is directly in line with what people want, while theirs is, they're kind of relying on the stars to align, like maybe this person's vision will also mean that the stock price will rise, which means that we execute that far better. Yes, I'll take it.
What you're describing on accountability is solved for by fiduciary law, which legally requires C-suite officials to act in accordance with investor and board decisions.
Bro, lawyers have fiduciary duties for you too. The bar to fulfill those fiduciary duties is like, you literally just have to demonstrate you haven't been overwhelmingly negligent. Any founder can just say, I've implemented this product that I think, like with my skill and expertise, will bring this company profit. Like, no law court will trial this person. Alright, secondly, founders have perverse incentives to structure companies in a way that deletes recourse. That is because these people can develop charters or constitutions in ways that benefit them when they know they're going to become an executive in the future. This looks like, for example, what what Mark Zuckerberg did before Meta went IPO, where they literally put a clause in the Meta constitution that overrided shareholder preferences. It looks like, for example, mining CEOs who now just do things in the charter to dilute shares to prevent shareholder activism. It looks like family conglomerates in countries like South Korea, where they just entrench power of C-suite appointments, so they can just hand out certain voting, they can entrench voting powers so that people in their family can be the ones that are put in these kind of C-suite appointments. They have very powerful influence in shareholder rules, and they have an incentive to do so when they know they're going to be executives. They don't have that incentive under our side when they know they're not going to be an executive and they're going to have to leave the company. I guess the analogy, if you didn't understand the technical explanation, is imagine if you had a president of a government who now knows that they have the power to decide the terms of the next election. They'll obviously just gerrymander the fuck out of it, right? Which is what empirically people like Mark Zuckerberg have done, which means that they're never going to be held accountable and never going to be kicked out of the company. Yep.
Your case is sometimes long-term incentives don't align with investors, which honestly seems like a good thing, but I've yet to hear why people can't use the same accountability mechanism, i.e.
Panel B, look out for the straw man. They say long-term, but we don't know if it's long-term. We don't know their incentives. This is just the vision. You don't structurally prove why that vision necessarily is long-term or good for shareholders. The shareholders don't even know if it's long-term or not. Thirdly, these people become irreversibly attached to the function and the outcome of that company. Maybe the worst case on our side is that at the point of the IPO, there is some unconfidence, which is obviously bad, but that is far better than when that company becomes entirely entrenched with the reputation of that person, and at the point at which that person quits, dies of an illness, or just really goes rogue or something like that, you are unable to make that separation. Importantly, on our side, it's actually a benefit when there is that uncertainty, because instead, companies develop structures and systems to mean that they're not hedged entirely on that personality. They're likely to create a better product than rely on shareholder confidence in just the brain behind the operation. And lastly, as I explained in PI, we can actually get both and they can't. The reason why this doesn't mitigate both sides is because when you have a norm under their side, that means when companies select out out of appointing these founders, that shatters the confidence in their company, therefore they cannot do that. While on our side, we can be selective about which kind of people into these positions. For these reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to open the case of closing opposition, I call upon the member of Fox. Here.
Is there a way, does anyone mind if I turn the lights on?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, wow.
That is better.
Much easier to read my very small notes now. What we're going to do on closing opposition, very, very simple. First, we're going to explain why the shift in pre-IPO incentives of founders is much worse in government's world when the norm shifts and is now, they expect, because the counter norm is that you expect to be removed and replaced once your company hits IPO, why that shift makes worse incentives in the pre-IPO stage. Secondly, why cult of personalities actually lead to good things, explaining why a lot of these visions are going to be good after the IPO. So I think on closing opposition, we're going to win both in the pre and the post-IPO world. First, let's explain what this shift looks like. First of all, note that because you know you're going to be replaced, there's much less post-IPO accountability for the things you've done, right? It's easy for you to embellish certain things about what your company's performance looks like. It's easy for you to oversell things because once those things are revealed after the IPO stage, after your replacement, often in the 6 months afterwards, potentially years afterwards, it can be hard to tell, especially with tech companies where nobody knows things. Like people are just saying shit about AI now to try and get investment funding that anyone who studies the field knows is bullshit, but regular people, investors, don't understand this. I don't even understand it, and I'm doing a master's degree in it. But the point is, now, the person who replaces you is the one who takes the fall and takes the accountability for that. But secondly, presumably, since you're being removed, you have to kind of be bought out of the position, right? Maybe you own shares. It's quite common for founders to have the shares they own bought out when they go to market and people want to replace them and kick them out because they have a different vision for this company than what the founder did. But since I want my buyout, and I know I'm going to get bought out once we go to IPO, to be as high as possible, my incentive as the founder is to embellish the ambitions of the company and the potential valuation of the company to be as high as possible so I can justify to whatever the board is that's determining how much of a payout I deserve, or if I own shares, how much of the forced selling of those shares is going to be. I can earn as much money because if people perceive the company as being worth more at IPO sale, that means I make more money as a founder when I'm removed. But thirdly, I think this leads to a lot of the type of investments that you're going to get, just as like an additional point on this idea, just in terms of like company ambitions and how people frame this, that since you're being removed, there's probably a lot of sort of speculative pump and dump type investment of people who want to see make money in the interim at the IPO stage. That probably also leads to volatility. But I think the impact of this kind of accountability point and shift in incentive point is that you get a lot more Elizabeth Holmes type situations where people have semi-fraudulent or at least embellished visions for their company and manage to successfully dupe a lot of people. And this is going, like, obviously this happens already to some degree, but the point is it happens a lot more in as far as it's easy for you to escape this accountability and in as far as you don't actually have to suffer the long-term consequences of your vision being removed. Because I think it's a mitigating factor if I'm trying to pitch to investors, I have this crazy, ridiculous vision and we're going to make AI blockchain that's going to change the way people write on pen and paper or something. Because if I don't actually have any, if I know that I'm going to be removed in the long term, then I don't actually care about the things I'm pitching, right? It's easy for people to justify this kind of thing, because my only incentive isn't the long-term viability of this idea, of this vision, it's the perceived viability and the perceived upside of this vision, such that I want to maximize the IPO return on my removal from the company. Closing?
There is no recourse on your side because people invest, and if the founder goes rogue, there's no way to remove them.
I think like people, the entire media circus looking at the founder and looking at you still being in this position, like I think Elizabeth Holmes probably faced a lot of pushback for what she did. I think this is a pretty reasonable explanation on why people don't have incentive to do this. But as well, you're just earning more money because if the share price is shot to infinity because of the crazy things you've been saying to the media, you earn more money. I think it's a pretty clear incentive. Front half? No? Back half? Do you have another point? Okay, well I can't really take two if there's not two to take. Let's talk about why personality, cults of personality is good. And I want to point out to some level, opening government does concede that a lot of these visions are meaningful problems in the market you've successfully solved. So I think it's a little curious, closing government then comes up and says that actually a lot of these visions are just crazy and really, really bad. I think it's a bit curious. Maybe not a knife, but a spoon or something, right? 2 points here on cult of personality being good. First of all, a lot of founders care about things other than profit. I do think it's somewhat strange how we just sort of have assumed up until this point in the debate that shareholder profit is actually the most important thing and is actually good. Because I think founders have values and things that they genuinely like that aren't necessarily things that put money in shareholders' pockets. They care about making the world a better place. They care about their legacy, and that means bad press for what your company's doing matters. That means you care about, that means you care about the types of things your company is doing actually, not only whether or not that company is making money. So if you can earn a lot of money exploiting workers, I genuinely think there are some founders who are not going to go this direction because they care about their company's impact on the world. Shareholders don't care about this kind of thing. So what this means is that you have kind of unique non-profit-based incentives to pitch different things to your shareholders to pursue the slightly less aggressively capitalist thing as opposed to the maximally aggressive capitalist thing. I know that probably government whip's going to come up and say, but fiduciary stuff means that you're just going to do it anyways because the shareholders are going to force you to behave in an evil way. But I don't think this is true. Even if this is somewhat marginal, I still think it's a pretty meaningful point. But secondly, you're inundated from the kind of corporate bubble that all sort of the CEOs who are going to replace you come in. First of all, note that you've self-selected as just what your vision is. The fact you made it to the IPO means your vision is probably not completely crazy. But the second thing is that founders do come from a different demographic. And I think the kind of managerial world is a place of extraordinary privilege. It's expensive to get into these management schools. The people who get these jobs usually come from wealthy, well-networked backgrounds. And I think that having people who come from different backgrounds, at least sometimes, is probably a good thing to have those people in some level of representation running some of the largest companies in the world. I think it's good to have people who haven't spent their entire life walking around at business school, talking with other privileged kids, coming in this completely sort of fabricated reality where profit is always what's good for humanity when obviously it isn't. I think very, very clear, simple to understand case from closing opposition. Practical.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close the debate inside government, I call upon the God Whip. Here.
Closing up case is intention. First extension says the minute you have to leave, it means they're just going to steal your stake or embellishing and literally commit financial fraud. Second extension says, but these founders kind of care about the products, they're kind of altruistic, not super profit driven. If both of these cases are true, I think that extensions die, and that's the reason why you have to put them in last place. So as a result, but before then, let's do some line-by-line analysis of what CEO bring us. Their first extension outside the tension suggests pre-IPO norms is worse. They say that you sell them stake or you embellish things. Number one, this doesn't happen because you can literally get sued. In the process of an IPO, you go through heaps and heaps of due diligence. Their take is the person after takes the fall, but if you're the person running the business and you are doing the lying, of course you take the fall, which once again defeats this notion. The second thing we said here is that, now they want to increase the value because they want their shares to be bought out. But prior to an IPO, there are no shares in the company. There is nothing to be bought out, which is to say that therefore means this is once again something unlikely to occur. Which therefore means, I think this is a closing opposition team which has not fulfilled their burden to prevent literal financial fraud exists, which is why you ought to discredit this extension. The second extension then is to say cult of personalities are actually sometimes relatively good. The first thing here is that David's frame about in absence of this norm, maybe the absolute best managers who are like the go-to manager might say, oh, but you weed out all the shit kickers, kind of deals with it. So we can, to an extent, claim their benefit. But the second thing to observe here, as I explained, this is already intention and therefore unlikely to be particularly important. Again, cannot have their cake and eat it too. The next thing I'm going to do in this speech then is explain why our extension wins this debate. The thing to say here is this, our extension is simple. This norm is principally unjust because it makes these companies fundamentally unaccountable. The extent of OG's analysis is to say cult of personality exists. David provides you a whole set of structural reasons and incentives as to how this actually occurs. Whether it's because these people hold a large number of shares, whether it is because they make it particularly difficult to alter the constitution so they can't issue new shares, so they can't dilute their own voting power, or alternatively to literally model in a veto power so people like Zuckerberg can override shareholder resolutions because the constitution permits it, are ways to create entrenched power and prevent any forms of accountability. The only response we hear is from a POI from LO, which is saying, but don't fiduciary duties also exist to regulate it? Few responses. Number one, fiduciary obligation is a duty to not have a conflict of interest and a duty to not profit. Very, very easy to do. And the things we discuss about the company's failure, the things we discuss about overriding a shareholder's accountability, obviously fall outside the parameters of this to do so. But more so, secondly, the way and the mechanism we give you here is about the altering of company charters and constitutions is actually what shields these founders from liability. Because at the point where you have bought these shares, you have consented to this is the way how it operates, you've consented to the amount of voting power you have when you buy a Class A or Class B share, and as a result, you cannot complain, you have no forms of recourse, which is why it is insufficient. The three reasons as to why this extension is in and of itself winning this debate. The first of which is this principle is agnostic to the opening clash about whether company founders are good or bad. We broadly don't care. We think that any form of accountability is good and we maximize it on the outside. The second thing to be said is that this is obviously unjust because when shareholders pay for shares, they pay to get some degree of control and some degree of voting rights. So at the point where you deny them the ability to have that, you've obviously breached this transaction and we think that is a principally regrettable thing. The third thing to note here is that OP also keep trying to read the mind of the company founder. Are they good? Are they altruistic? Are they a bit of a stake? We do not know this. You cannot possibly ascertain this, which is why the thing we default to is not the arbitrary, idiosyncratic company founder. We default to shareholders. We default to government regulation. I mean, that is far better at holding them accountable as opposed to the mechanisms they choose, which is functionally banking on their altruism. Closing.
Bad founders get worse, good founders get better. This is only tense if you don't understand that different people can be different from one another.
Presumably those incentives still exist whenever someone makes a decision in any first place, which is to say, obviously, like sometimes these weigh in on their mind in ways which are which kind of makes them have this decision calculus, which changes. Do you have anything?
Hiring and firing selectively creates uncertainty as much as always replacement does, because shareholders still don't know what to expect. Our harms on tanking IPO yields far outweigh your principle because shareholders still just want money.
I'll deal with you guys specifically after this. But then, how do you weigh this kind of extension? The way it weighs over OO to say we fit all the materials are IPOs being an inherent good, which is say we explain why you get less accountability, which is why obviously that benefit gets deleted. The way we weigh against our opening government is because the entire case is contingent on whether you believe these founders are good, obviously it's particularly speculative, which is why you opt for a more concrete and certain kind of principle of harm which exists in this debate. The last thing to do in this speech is punt OO a little bit more because they scare me a little bit. So, their case functioning here is volatility is a little bit scary to investors and very scary to investors and it's hard to get investments. The first thing to extent here is that we POI that to the extent this norm changes, then people already factor into account this volatility. The conclusion of that is just to say, when an IPO occurs, maybe it is lower than what you'd expect than what happens under the status quo. We think this is preferable for many reasons, and this deals with your POI. The first reason to why it's preferable, it means that when you opt into this, your value of your shares can eventually grow over time. But when it grows over time, it correlates to the skill and competency of that management, which means if they're actually good, and that is something as to what actually raises the value of the share, as opposed to banking on generally speaking that this kind of manager is going to be good, manager is going to be bad, and that is what feeds into things like cult of personality and the ability to kind of sell your product in a way which might be disingenuous. The second thing to note here is that whilst X case framing is clever to suggest that IPOs often happen when you intend to raise capital, I think this isn't actually true in many instances. Sometimes you have an IPO because you want to enter into a new market. So for example, when DD wanted to enter into the American market, sometimes it is because you're simply too big and the government compels you to have an IPO to make it far more easier for you to regulate. So note that this kind of thing that most of these companies on the precipice of maybe failing and they need this injection of capital and they survive is probably untrue. But recognizing that this is a mystery, the reason as to why this is still an unimportant harm compared to our principle is just to explain that for these companies which they care about the most, the IPO simply will not
save them for many reasons, which say they probably do not have the super charismatic Silicon Tech Bro billionaire. Your product is probably somewhat sussy in many of these instances. Even if you have an IPO, and even if you raise some capital, there are probably structural reasons as to why your company is somewhat flawed in these instances, which is why it does not actually work. That's why people that care about the most, this is a norm which does not actually assist them. But also note under comparatives, what happens under them? They stay private and they kind of just assume they get tank. That's really untrue, right? So insofar as they have a product which has some potential, you probably just get bought out by a much larger company, someone who's able to develop it, and some company which has the infrastructure to make it better. And that probably is actually preferable from having this company go through the process of going to IPO and faltering, but more so being able to hedge against a bigger company who's able to shoulder that risk and make it better. So that is why the most salient harm of our OO team also weighs for our argument about accountability. I think this debate is simply a principled debate. We did not care about the specific litigations of who this person was. The thing we rely on is shareholders rely on government regulation.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close the debate as a whole, I call up on the quick. Here.
Am I good to begin? Team by team, starting with CG. I have three things to say about CG. First, you're absolutely right, this debate primarily applies when the founder's interests come apart from the shareholders' interests. That's why this is back half debate. We uniquely explain to you why it is that the founder's interests are generally speaking better than the shareholders' interests, because we like the idiosyncratic vision over the pure profit motive they are defending. Second thing about CG, they say we prioritize the shareholders in this debate. Absolutely, we should not. They're upper middle class fucks. We prioritize the average person. We benefit most of the kinds of goods and services and world improvement that the founders are going to be incentivized to do. Third thing about CG, they say on the incentives before the ICO, they're better on their side. No, we flip this with our extension where we explain why there's more long-termism done on the pre-ICO stage when they now know that their future job and their future money and their future reputation is going to be hinged to the long-term success of this company. That's how we beat out CG. Okay, great. Let me quickly talk about our case and why we win this back half, which as we explained is I think the most important split in this debate. There were three main responses to our case. First, on the pre-ICO founders' incentives, we get the idea, well, you can just be sued. This is a straw man of our case. It's not just about doing illegal things, it's about doing stupid short-termist things. The analogy to Elizabeth Holmes was just that, an analogy. It's about the idea of sort of liquidating assets that might be useful in the long term in order to artificially inflate the price of your company right now so you can get the most bang for your buck when the ICO happens. That was their case. They completely strawmanned it. The second response to our pre-ICO founders incentive thing was, well, there's just no recourse because you can't really remove the founder at all on our side. There absolutely is some recourse on our side in two main ways. First, we explained to you on the money front why it is that if the company now does well in the long term, when the founder sticks around as the CEO, they're now going to make more money. All that's pretty self-evident. And second, on the reputational level, you want your company that you're now running to be doing well in the future, in the long term. That's how we do indeed get the recourse, even if, yes, you're right, that you don't necessarily get them fired on our side. Third main response to our case, again from CG, was the idea of tension. Well, are they good people? Are they bad people? Both are true. People are complex. We explained to you why they have incentives pulling them one way and incentives pulling them the other way, and why, importantly, the norm is good on both fronts. Why? Because the norm, as we explained, mitigates the financial incentive to fuck over the company in the short term in the pre-ICO stage, and why the norm increases the founder's incentives for engaging in long-term world improvement. We can have our cake and eat it too. Cake is yummy, and I'm hungry. Yes, I'll take you.
Companies should be incentivized to have an actually good product or process before going public, rather than just relying on one person whose mind no one can read.
Broadly speaking, if they are indeed getting to the IPO stage, their product is probably pretty good. And they have a lot of incentives to make their product pretty good, insofar as they want to, have people invest. I think all this was pretty much dealt with by our top half. I'm not going to engage much more on that.
When the visionary resourceful entrepreneur you characterize leave, they have a desire to create the next new thing. Isn't that way more productive than incremental changes to Amazon stock prices or product quality?
I was going to respond to that later, but I'll respond to the next new thing now. The problem is, if indeed you're right about the whole cult of personality thing, when they leave, they're going to bring all their cultists with them. This will hollow out and thus fuck over the old company, and so I'm not entirely convinced why the market as a whole gets better. Okay, great. Let's talk about, I have three main things to say. First, they talk a lot about the delicacy of going public, why it is that we need to preserve the C-suite in order to allow stability. I have two main problems with this. First, as OG points out, it's unclear why it is that them staying in an advisory position will be insufficient for the apparent continuity. We uniquely, as I'm going to expand on later, are going to plug this gap, and we explain why the founders will not stay as advisors, and that's why you don't get the sort of perceived stability that they claim you get. The second main problem with this is, as CG points out, rather fairly, if there is indeed no norm of remaining, investors won't
won't be spooked by people leaving because now everyone's going to be doing this, and so now all startups are going to be replacing founders, so it'll be normalized. I'm going to prove in about 30 seconds why it is that we actually can then overcome this CG response, which I do think is pretty good. All right, second main thing to say about OO. They talk a lot about wanting to expand faster and having, like, I don't know, all this investment and whatnot. I want to feel like neither top half team actually shows that these companies expanding as fast as possible is actually a good thing. Like, we can just say maybe it's fine if they expand slower insofar as this gives competition more time to rise to prevent the market from monopolizing. Why is it actually good if we have the first mover advantage exacerbating even further and then allowing tech startups to basically monopolize the market and then engage in anti-competitive practices? I'm not entirely clear why I care at all about the speed of expansion of these companies. Third main thing to say about OO is they say, well, on the skills front, they say, well, founders have a lot of important skills and the alternative CEOs also have skills. This is true, but I think we can outweigh this when we say that what they're entirely missing here is that replacement CEOs have uniquely perverse incentives. Why? Because they want to change courses dramatically. Why? Because they want to justify their hiring. And a clear example here is the new Pepsi marketing officer spending millions and millions of dollars to just slightly tweak the Pepsi logo to justify why he was hired in the first place. This is uniquely bad for stability, so we get all the harms that OO talks about with stability. All right, now, with OG, I have a million things to say. Sorry, I couldn't spit it into 3 neat boxes. First, they say why it is that sort of the founders can just stay on as advisors, but the problem here is that they're not going to advise if indeed OG is right about their framing about these people being control crazy, and cult of personality type people. On the skill front, I think it's broadly speaking a wash against all the stuff that OO gives us and why it is that the founders have company-specific experience and skills and why the founders are better managing this specific company. There's no way in their top half clash there was a wash. Next, on the idea of founders being sort of good at creation and innovation, not necessarily management, I'm entirely unclear why it's bad if post-ICO companies prioritize creation and innovation over being super well managed. I don't entirely know why we care about which companies manage the best. If maybe they take a long shot on some good or service that might indeed massively improve the quality of life for many people, even if this is at the expense of the company specifically, if this good comes out of it and then benefits the average person, I think that's slay. Okay, next, they say that, and this is the critical concession from their case, that founders, largely speaking, are emotionally attached to like solving a problem in society that they've envisioned. This was directly from their speech. This is why we win, because this is way better than the profit motive, because profit leads to exploitation, leads to all sorts of skullduggery, and whereas founders, when they're sort of course, getting,
Point.
Yeah, so founders not only care about this vision, but also want the reputation that comes from sort of actually making the world a better place, because they've already gotten paid. At the point at which they have the IPO, they have fat stacks in their wallet, so they're now way less incentivized to pursue profit at the expense of everything else. What they now want is probably reputation, is legacy critical. Diggory's case was an emotional one, where indeed, CG says, the founder's interests come apart from the shareholders' interest, where the profit motive comes apart from all this emotional and legacy and reputational stuff. That's where we take this debate, that's where the wiggle room is, that's why we win. Also, same response here that I gave to OO on the idea of, well, why should we care about new people knowing how to expand, because I'm not clear on why indeed expansion is the best thing in this space. I'm not going to take you over sorry, I have so much to talk about. Okay, next on OG, they say that founders, broadly speaking, take more risks, and this is bad. But I'm entirely unclear on, first, why actually it's bad for companies to be taking tons of risk. If they take a risk on some cool product that might be the next iPhone, maybe the next internet or whatever, this is probably good for society overall. But also, I don't even think they win on this, because broadly speaking, the new people are going to be taking more risks, because it is that the founders are going to be beholden to sort of legacy, whereas the replacement CEOs are pretty much only beholden to shareholders. And uniquely, shareholders only want short-term profit. They want to sort of get a quick buck on this share. They want, after the IPO, they want it to rise in its value and then be able to sell and then go on to the next stock. So shareholders uniquely prioritize sort of making a quick buck at the expense of the long-term company health. So even if you think risk is the thing that this debate is won or lost on, we can take it. Lastly, on the whole democratizing decisions, as our whole case intends with very nicely, the shareholder incentives are uniquely bad because, as I just said, they want the stock price to rise as quick as possible, not as sort of because of benefiting society overall or whatever, but just because they want to make it like a unicorn company, wanting to prop it up in any ways, either legal or illegal, and for that reason, this is broadly speaking making a company that does things that don't actually benefit the average person. This was a lot, I know, but broadly speaking, we explained to you why we don't really care about the success of the companies, because we weren't entirely convinced by anyone that modern startups actually do more good than bad in the world. What we do care about is slightly shifting the incentive structures of these companies away from pure profit and pure exploitation towards benefiting the average person, towards enacting the cool, visionary vision of the leaders to solve a problem that they see in the world. We solve these problems, no one else does. So proud to oppose. Thank you very much.